Great news on the national security front here in Canada, in fact all across North America, for an issue not furthered here in this country, but put forward by the American president just last week. Donald Trump signing an executive order on EMPs, electromagnetic pulse warfare. This is something a lot of people have been calling for a while now, including yours truly. I wrote a book on that, released in 2017, called Pulse Attack, the real story behind the secret weapon that can destroy North America. So what is this issue before we get into why this executive order is a good thing? Well, I first seriously heard about the issue a few years ago when I sat down with a gentleman who had run the CIA under the Bill Clinton years. And we were talking about a different issue, the Iran deal. But at the end of that conversation, he said, hey, do you have a moment? I want to talk to you about the EMP issue, something that I'm trying to raise awareness for. Now, I had heard about EMPs just a little bit here and there. It pops up in science fiction and video games just a bit, and it seemed, quite frankly to me, like something like a conspiracy theory, or I wasn't sure, people just making blogs about it here and there. As I studied the issue further though and talked to very senior people, I realized how this was such an underreported issue, and it is stranger than fiction, stranger and more worrisome and more troublesome than those fictional representations made it out to be. To make a long story short, an electromagnetic pulse is the consequence of a nuclear detonation that happens atmospherically, up in the sky. And it sends out these gamma rays that, if they get into electronics and technology below them, can short circuit them, can fry them, can blow them up. Now, the United States and the Soviets first became aware of this at the end of the Second World War and during the Cold War. They were doing a whole bunch of nuclear tests, and as they were doing these tests up in the sky, they found that down below them in places like Hawaii or Kazakhstan, parts of the electric grid went down. And they thought, whoa, we have a situation on our hands here. We didn't expect this would be one of the consequences, one of the side effects of our nuclear development. So they wanted to learn more about it, but in 1963, JFK introduced the Partial Test Bans, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and what that did was ban, among other things, atmospheric testings. Now, this was good news in terms of slowing down the Cold War and the arms race, getting people to not want to collect nuclear weapons and develop them as much as before, but the downside from it is scientists could no longer do research on EMP. They could no longer do primary source material, collect that primary source material, and do research on it. So a lid was brought down on the topic, on the issue. People just left it really to side researchers here and there, but they didn't get a lot of advances on it. A lot of the original material and technology and reports they were working on were from a long time ago. Fast forward to several decades, and there are a lot of nefarious actors that are still interested in this technology despite those bans on testing. We already know that this is in the nuclear and military strategies of China, of Russia, and we also know North Korea is very interested in it. In fact, the other year, after they did their 6 nuclear tests, they released a statement saying, it's so great we're now developing our nuclear program, and we can also continue with the idea of EMP, part of our strategic vision. Whoa, hold on, I said when I saw this announcement. This is the first time one country has threatened to release an electromagnetic pulse attack on the world, on whatever target they want to have. This is not a good situation at all. Well, what would happen if there was an EMP attack on Canada or on the United States? Well, the worst case scenario is an incredibly troubling one. If the power grid is taken down, which could happen, if the electrical wires are fried, if massive amounts of electricity go through them, go to the transformer stations, damage them, melt them down, blow them up, we could be without power for a very long time. Not just days, but weeks or months, maybe even years. And we live in something called an electronic civilization, where the whole basic facts of the way we live now is structured around using electricity, being able to live in tall towers and tall buildings, being able to commute, drive into the cities, our water filtration systems, all of that, all of our regional food hubs, how we feed ourselves, it's all built around electronically fueled components and a way of life. So our current way of life would cease to be. We would go back to how we lived in the early parts of the 19th century. So is this thing really possible? Could it cause damage like that? Well, there isn't just man-made EMPs, these weapons, there's also naturally occurring EMPs, otherwise known as solar flares. NASA predicts there's about a 10% chance of one of these occurring every decade. Now, 10% sounds a little low, but compared to your odds for winning the lottery or having your house burned down, that's actually incredibly high, and we still buy lottery tickets and we still get home insurance. 10% incredibly worrisome. Well, has something like that ever happened to the Earth before? Yes, it actually has. In 1859, something called the Carrington event struck Earth, a very, very heavy solar flare getting its way into the atmosphere, and it actually blew up a lot of the electronics on Earth. The only thing is it was 1859 and there weren't that many electronics. There were telegraphs and there's the transatlantic cable. They were damaged, and that's about it. What would happen if something like that hit us now? Either from a solar flare or from a nefarious actor like North Korea? We would be in big trouble. Such big trouble that after it happened and society had basically collapsed, people would say, why didn't we do anything to prevent it? And that's what a lot of researchers and advocates on this issue are now calling for. So what do we do? Well, part of the challenge is that because we don't have that primary research, we're a little uncertain on exactly how things would happen, how bad it would be, and what you can do to prevent it. But it's largely believed that one of the things we need to do is look into our utilities grids, into our power grid, and replace the parts, as they need replacing, with more resilient parts, EMP compliant parts. Basically, very elaborate surge protectors, the sort of stuff we already have on our home electronics to deal with lightning strikes. A lot of estimates show it's really not that expensive. It's really not going to take all that much effort and energy. So we have the risk of a black swan event, something that's basically societal collapse from one rogue state inflicting this upon North America. But it's actually solved in a relatively boring way, in a boring regulatory way. Donald Trump's executive order calls for more study. It calls for an identification of critical infrastructure and assets that are at risk, and then calls for a plan to look at how to mitigate that and to make it more resilient. An excellent decision, something that needs to be done in Canada to make progress on that. The good news, and why this is good for Canada, is that if the US electricity grid is protected, the Canadian grid is somewhat protected as well, because we don't actually run east-west with our electricity grids, we run north-south. You got the western seaboard, the eastern seaboard. When there's a big blackout in Toronto and Montreal and other parts of Canada over a decade ago, well, that also happened in upstate New York because we were all along the same lines. So we're all in this together. Great news that Trump has done that executive order. We're going to have to pay attention to the follow-through, hope it gets implemented well, and let's call for something here in Canada as well. There are a number of people who are interested in seeing this in Canadian politics. It's a nonpartisan issue. Justin Trudeau himself, he called for a look at critical infrastructure to make sure it's resilient. When I was researching my book, I asked the Public Safety Office and others if that includes EMP. They didn't really specify. The Canadian government is unfortunately not that aware of the issue, filed many access to information requests, talked to experts, talked to the one public servant who is tasked with looking into solar flare issues, and they're paying attention, they're just not paying attention enough. But the good news, there is progress happening on this issue. As I said, I go into detail on all aspects of this story, the history of it, the background, the people, the players, what countries like North Korea are doing, and what Canada should do. All of that in my 2017 book, Pulse Attack, the real story behind the secret weapon that can destroy North America. It's still available up at Amazon.